Good afternoon. As you are all aware, mitigating the risk of spreading COVID-19 during the Congress requires the cooperation of all of us. In line with the COVID-19 prevention concept elaborated by our host country, Japan, and the Secretariat, I would like to kindly remind you of the following precautions. Fill in the contact tracing information sheet found on your assigned table or seat. Maintain at least 2 meters of physical distance from each other when not seated at your assigned seat and avoid gathering in groups. Wear your FFP2 mask at all times. You may only decide to take your mask off when you are given the floor. Do not attend the meeting if you are unwell. If you feel ill during a Congress session, contact the medical personnel stationed in each conference room. These measures are in place for the safety of all of us. I thank you for your support and attention. Welcome.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is with great honor that I welcome you to this ancillary meeting hosted by the CRTG Working Group on Violence Against Children recruited by terrorist and violent extremist groups, the cycle of victimization. My name is Cecilia Polizzi and I'm the President, the Founder and the Executive Director at CRTG Working Group. Thank you for joining us today. The recruitment of children by terrorist groups is characterized by extreme brutality and violence. During enlistment, children are exposed to systematic abuses, including ferocious recruitment methods, sexual exploitation, enslavement, threat. Children are actively and systematically used in military operations as human shields, carriers of person-borne explosive devices, or as suicide bombers. The gravity of violence brought against children by terrorist actors imposes devastating consequences. It may result in early death or inflict extensive harm to the individual child, impairing personal, intellectual, and social development, leaving survivors severely traumatized and having to endure the consequences of profound physical and emotional scars. Furthermore, the association of children with terrorist organizations entails a stigmatization and a high risk of becoming victims of secondary violence at the hand of law enforcement, military forces, and communities following apprehension, demobilization, and return. While it exists a depth of shared international commitment towards the protection of children against serious forms of violence, protecting children affected by terrorism requires sustained, inclusive, and multilateral responses globally. I truly look forward to a very diverse group of distinguished experts sharing their views and observation on this grave issue, subject of today's high-level discussion. And it's with great pleasure that I now introduce our panel. We will open the conversation by hearing from Ian Bradbury, former military serving the Royal Canadian Regiment, counterterrorism advisor and CEO at the 1st New Allied Expeditionary Force in Canada. Dr. Shelley Whitman, Executive Director at Romeo Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security. Peter Lowe, Principal Consultant at Fronesi Consulting and Training and former Director of the Countering Violent Extremism for Juvenile Justice Unit in the New South Wales Department of Justice. Dr. Anita Berezin, Senior Advisor to the Office of the National Security Council in Croatia, Guest Lecturer at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies and NATO Center of Excellence in Ankara, representing in this forum the European Commission Radicalization Awareness Network. We will therefore host a high-level statement from Virginia Gamba, Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, and Paul Williams, First Secretary of the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations in Vienna. Thank you. And I am going now to start by opening the floor to Ian Bradbury. Mr. Bradbury, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. And thank you to Cecilia and to the CRTG Working Group, to the United Nations for hosting this event. It's an honor to take part and to present on the cycles of victimization affecting children alongside my esteemed colleagues on this panel. A special thank you to the city of Kyoto, the citizens of Japan, and all the wonderful support staff that brought this event together. And lastly, to those attending and joining us both in person and those joining us online. My name is Ian Bradbury. I am the founder and CEO of the first NAF in Canada. It's a nonprofit aids in the peace and stability sector. I'm also the president of Terra Nova Strategic Management. Please bring up my PowerPoint there. And today I'll be presenting on an overview on children exploited by terrorist and extremist actors, and on the pressing need for us to act on the challenges the children of our world face in relation to this topic. Second slide, please. It isn't news to any of us here today that extremist and terrorist actors manipulate, victimize, and exploit children and youth for their interest, or that there are hundreds of millions of children affected by violence and terrorist acts worldwide, or that radicals, extremists, and terrorist actors around the world seek out and target our most precious and vulnerable. Next slide. We know quite well that the violent extremist actors have exploited the vulnerabilities of children and youth as key elements of their strategies throughout history for use as perpetrators of violence and attacks, bombings, and fighting roles. We know that they are also used in support roles as informants, spies, tools of propaganda, and ultimately as the next generation loyalists and leaders for their group's particular interests. Next slide, please. The idea that the young ones of our world present a right group of soft targets for nefarious parties seeking to influence, indoctrinate, and control is a point of concern that we have gathered to speak on many times before. Collectively, we critically understand that a developing mind and identity, along with underdeveloped experiences and understandings and innocence, is inherently vulnerable to the pathways of extremism. And with this, we know that once these young minds have been captured by extremism, that they become even more susceptible to the most radical and extreme elements that they are exposed to. Slide, please. Extremist actors and terrorist actors target children and youth in every corner of our world, in every country, and in every society. And this particular targeting is based on complex and diverse sets of conditions and pathways. This happens in conflict zones where conditions are under consistent strain, near conflict zones that are either adjacent to conflict zones or are destabilizing into conflict or have recently seen the cessation of violence. And it also happens in peaceful countries as well. It is hard to imagine, but I stress, children and youth in every corner of our world are vulnerable to and are being targeted by extremists and terrorist actors. Next slide, please. The true numbers of children directly affected by terrorist actors are unknown. And even in the best works, we can only provide us with insights. And in many cases, only estimates can be provided. The conditions these children face are complex, nuanced, and circumstance dependent, and that there are a multitude of factors and scoping considerations that can impact on the reporting and assessment of numbers. These include, but are not limited to, which groups and actors are taken into consideration for the assessment. The full spectrum of threats are rarely considered, and we often narrow our focus to a limited set of actors. The location, area, country, or region of assessment also has direct impacts on the numbers present. Conflict zones tend to be saturated for analysis. Some near conflict zones are also, while other near conflict zones and peaceful areas often fall outside of the scope, resulting in assessment and reporting gaps. The specific victim groups included for consideration and analysis can also greatly affect how numbers present. And the age of those assessed will also cause significant fluctuation, with some analysis taking into account persons under 15, some under 18, Some youth-inclusive models consider individuals up to 25 years old. The current estimates, using UN criteria, place the number somewhere around 450 million children and youth around our world, or about 25% of children and youth worldwide affected by violence and terrorist actions. That's approximately a 150% increase observed since 2017. Next slide, please. As noted earlier in my presentation, there are a diverse and complex set of victims groups for us to consider. They too vary widely depending on the particular manifestation or type of extremism under assessment, the area, region, or countries that are in scope, as well as any specific conditions that may be in focus, such as children and youth manifesting as suicide bombers, an example of a specific group. We look at Group A, which includes locals from communities that are participatory to, sympathetic with, or supportive of any given or extremist or terrorist actors. Group B, foreigners who are sympathetic to, associated with, adjacent to, or identify with, or even participate as a particular group, manifestation, or form of extremism. Next slide, please. Group C are locals from communities under the forceful control of or violently contested by extremists and terrorist actors. These are people that are under the constant threat of the actions that these persons will take against them. And Group D is foreign communities that are targeted for extremist or terrorist acts that are outside of conflict or near conflict zones. Next slide, please. So what happens to the children and youth that are affected by terrorist actors? Well, these too also vary widely depending on the group, area, and specific conditions under assessment. Some of the commonalities that we see include exposure to extreme violence, either as perpetrator, target victim, or as an observer. Psychological manipulations, grooming techniques, and horrible indoctrinations to capture their minds and make them more susceptible to propaganda, indoctrination, and control. They see physical abuse and torture as common techniques employed in the process of breakdown of an individual. They see it as corporal punishment and also as a power control mechanism, and as a tool for hardening that individual as part of an in-group ritual, part of indoctrination. They suffer sexual abuse and rape as common techniques that are used and employed against children by extremist actors. This happens against all genders and for a multitude of purposes. We see slavery and human trafficking. It's a common source of money for these nefarious actors, and it's worn bodies to suit whatever role that they have in mind. There are proximity activities and actions of children and youth associated with extremists and terrorist actors that may expose them to policing and criminal justice systems, possibly intelligence or military activities in the worst case scenarios. On these points, it must be carefully noted that there are unique, complex, and dynamic gender considerations present across all the ways that children and youth are affected by terrorist actors. However, it is important to acknowledge that male children and youth predominantly score the highest across victims' analytics criteria. The exception being for considerations of sexual violence. Although, based upon the findings of my team's Lost Boys of the 21st Century project, it should be highlighted that this deviation may, in fact, be a result of a critical underassessment of sexual violence against males, adults, youth, and children alike. Next slide, please. As with many of my earlier points, the ways that children suffer and are victimized by extremists and terrorist actors varies. There are psychological traumas resulting in acute PTSD, social withdrawal, or a host of other traumas triggered and associated wounds. There are physical injuries, disfigurement, amputations, and other physical wounds that they will have to suffer through. They may have sexually transmitted infections, some treatable, others lifelong. They may all have also suffered injuries to their cognitive and social development, as well as personal identity perceptions. And most concerning in these considerations is the reality that without appropriate treatments for their wounds and injuries, the probability that many of these children will fall into the cycles of violence themselves is significantly increased. And with that, intergenerational traumas will persist. Next slide, please. Precarious global conditions of the present day are exacerbating our situation. We are still experiencing the overwhelming of our aid and response capacities that resulted from the unprecedented humanitarian crisis caused by the Islamic State. We are in the middle of the global SARS COVID-19 pandemic, and countries around the world are experiencing increasing conditions of instability. We're seeing shifting and competing global powers, philosophies, and interest clashing. Technological and connectivity advances have created a new frontier for extremist and terrorist actors to spread messages, target and reach vulnerable persons, and present their positions to the world, up to and including even the gaming industry these days. Next slide, please. Continuation of suffering for hundreds of millions of the world's children and youth who continue to be affected. Increased conflict as new generations take up the fight for whichever cause they will fall prey to. And more children and youth will be impacted as conditions persist. Even more if conditions worsen. Next slide, please. And quite pointedly, global peace and stability depends on our actions, not our words. Those actions need to be appropriately nuanced while addressing the complete spectrum of threat actors and victims' profiles. Left as is, with each passing decade, new generations of children and youth are manipulated, victimized, and exploited by extremist and terrorist actors. As children and youth victims grow into adults, they too will likely target the youth and children behind them, repeating the cycles of violence, repeating the cycles of victimization into the foreseeable future. And until humanity takes a stand and rightfully prioritizes putting an end to the exploitation of children, it's on us, those of us here today, to make this happen. Thank you very much for listening today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bradbury. Before giving the floor to our next speaker, I would like to present my apologies to our audiences as we are encountering some technical challenges in enabling one of our speakers. I am therefore asking to Ms. Perezine if she can please confirm audio and video correct setup.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Anita, we can hear you. Thank you very much. And thank you also to Ian Bradbury for such an interesting presentation. It is now with great pleasure that I invite Ms. Whitman to take the floor. Ms. Whitman, we welcome your remarks.
Thank you, Chair. Do I have the floor?
Mr. Williams, thank you very much. I was inviting Shelley Whitman to take the floor. Thank you.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
Shelley, can you hear us?
I'm very sorry. I seem to have some technical difficulties happening this morning. If I can have a cue that you can hear and see me, that would be wonderful.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I thank you very much this morning for allowing me the opportunity to present to you. My name is Shelley Whitman. I am the Executive Director of the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security. Today I want to talk to you a bit about the security sector perspectives of children who are involved in terrorism and extremism groups. The opportunity today to speak to this important event is one that I am grateful for. Very sorry that due to the circumstances we must do this from a distance. But the UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice is a critical forum to examine the increasing challenge of the recruitment and use of children in violence, and in particular, violent extremism. In November of 2020, the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security celebrated its 10th anniversary of working to progressively eliminate the recruitment and use of children as soldiers around the globe. Over the past 10 years, we have driven many important successes, such as co-creating the Vancouver Principles on Peacekeeping and the Prevention of the Recruitment and Use of Children as Soldiers in 2017, along with the Government of Canada. To date, we have 101 nations that have endorsed these principles around the world. The aim of the Vancouver Principles is to prioritize and further operationalize child protection within UN peacekeeping with a focus on tackling the recruitment and use of children as soldiers. The key principles of this document were informed by some of the critical gaps that existed in the current UN and national frameworks to address prevention of the recruitment and use of child soldiers globally, but also to specifically understand the security sector perspective in addressing this particular human rights atrocity. Despite such successes, the rise of violent extremism groups such as the Islamic State, Boko Haram, and more recently, increased attention to white supremacist groups such as the Proud Boys, have demonstrated that children continue to be victimized by the existence of these groups through direct and indirect exposure to indoctrination, to acts of violence, or used as pawns in conflicts that benefit adults' greed. Following a year of COVID-19 impact on our world, this virtual event reminds us of the unique challenges facing children, as well as the invisibility to many of these challenges. Children are more vulnerable to online radicalization as a result of increased screen time exposure and increased online activity of those who wish to recruit children into various violent right-wing, left-wing, religious, or anarchist groups. This is also coupled with the many stresses of those who are the caregivers, the economic uncertainties, and increased polarization of political views in a time of a global awakening to systemic racism and gender inequalities. The long-term impacts of this period in history on children's perceptions of others, their meaning-making of the world, as well as their sense of identity, will be critical to the future of peace and conflict. Today, there are an estimated 420 million children and youth who live in conflict-affected countries, many of whom are in need of urgent protection. This is all heightened by the changing nature of conflict and of war around the world. If in the past children were involved in conflict despite their age, they are now being recruited specifically because of their age. The strategic recruitment and use of children as a tactical innovation in war has been continuously manipulated, much as my previous colleague just stated. Tragically, there are a number of incentives for armed forces groups, and violent extremism groups are included in this, to recruit and use children. Yes, they are susceptible to manipulation. Children are also able to pass through communities and areas undetected. They are relatively low cost and able to fill ranks of many groups quite quickly. The Paris Principles and Guidelines define a child soldier as any person below the age of 18 years who is or who has been recruited or used by an armed force or armed group in any capacity, including but not limited to children, boys, and girls, used as fighters, cooks, porters, messengers, spies, or for sexual purposes. When many hear the phrase child soldier, the corresponding imagery is often an African boy with an AK-47 and a ragtag rebel group. But this is far from the only or the most predominant reality we have today. The reality is that we have young girls used as human bombs, young boys indoctrinated to act as executioners, children who are provided with no educational opportunities as a result of war or terrorism, and children born into extremist groups who are increasingly contributing to challenges of statelessness and legal obligations who are struggling to clearly address. Today, we need to challenge and unpack our perceptions about who is a child soldier and how this impacts our perceptions of who is a child associated with terrorism or violent extremism. At the Dallaire Institute, we have created a unique ability to understand the perspective of the security sector, be it the military or the police. Those who interact with children recruited and used by armed forces, groups, and gangs. Preventing violence against children in the context of armed conflict requires a dual lens that is focused on prioritizing the protection of children's rights, as well as understanding the significant operational impacts that are associated with the recruitment and use of children. Understanding the operational impacts by the security sector personnel requires a reconceptualization of the significance of the recruitment and use of children as a high priority concern for their professional development of the security sector, as well as the mission success, as well as their physical and mental health in the short and long term, and the moral injury that can come from such encounters with children. In order to shift attitudes that lead to action, it's critical to hear the voices of those who have been most impacted. We know that breaking the cycles of conflict requires the prioritization of children's protection as central to creating conditions for lasting peace, and this equally applies in the prevention of radicalization of children into violence. It is also critical to shape public discourse to better protect some of the world's most vulnerable children. We must take opportunities to nurture improved understanding and dialogue on this very complex issue. On Red Hand Day in February 2020, the Dallaire Institute hosted two people who were recruited and used as children in violence and armed conflict. And I wish to take a few moments to talk about these two individuals and how it's relevant to what we are discussing today. These two individuals were Omar Khadr and Ismail Baya. Both provided their first-hand experiences and clearly demonstrated the similarities in their experiences despite one being recruited and used as a child soldier in Sierra Leone's war, that being Ismail Baya, and the other being recruited and used as a child by well-known terrorist group Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, that being Omar Khadr. One is hailed as a resilient survivor who defeated the odds to become a successful global advocate and author, while the other has been vilified as a terrorist deserving of the harshest treatment of any individual, let alone a child, to suffer in the gallows of Guantanamo Bay. One receives speaking engagements, goodwill ambassadorial titles, book contracts. The other receives continuous threats to his life and his family, despite having served more than 10 years of torture and abuse in prison. However, for child protection agencies and those of us who are participating in this event today, the lived experiences of these two men are a cautionary tale about how progress in preventing recruitment and use of children in any violence requires taking a different stand, a stand that says the rights of children, all children, no matter which groups they may be associated with, must be raised to the top of the international peace and security agenda. This begins with an introduction of child protection into preventing or countering violent extremism programming and counter-terrorism operations. It requires new understandings and attitudes and behaviors by security sector personnel, by justice officials, and policymakers. For the past decade, we at the Dallaire Institute have worked tirelessly to make children in armed conflict more visible to security sector actors around the world through scenario-based training. A significant dilemma for the security sector occurs as they are forced to balance ethical considerations and their own rules of engagement with the basic needs to protect themselves and those around them. However, it must also be borne in mind that the interactions with children by security sector actors range from the non-lethal to the lethal spectrum and should not be reduced to merely a kinetic interaction. In addition, opposing forces often hesitate to react, underreact, or overreact to encountering children who are used in violence, which in turn provides a tactical advantage to the opposing forces. The same approach can be an important intervention to train military police personnel to see children recruited and used by violent and terrorist groups in a new light, as those who are deserving of a deeper understanding in terms of their lived experiences and their exposure to violence due to inequalities that have been exacerbated by power and greed. We know that there are many reasons as to why children are recruited and used by armed groups, as highlighted by our previous presenter. But the prevention of the recruitment and use of children has numerous protective factors when we think through the children in armed conflict lens. Those that work to support the efforts of child protection agencies and the international justice system, such as the Geneva Conventions, the Rome Statute, the Paris Principles, the International Labour Convention 182, UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and numerous UN Security Council resolutions. All of these provide a structure for the protection of children and the prosecution of perpetrators of this particular war crime. Unfortunately, there are far fewer acts of clear legislation for children who have been recruited and used by terrorist groups. The violent extremism lens has a distorting effect of the narrative of ideology, radicalization, and extremism that often fails to see the multifaceted, complex, and intertwined issues when it comes to children. Yet evidence has demonstrated that aspects related to ideology are rarely the primary driving force that motivate children associated with any armed group, gang, or extremism group. Approaches to repatriation of children, to their demobilization, to their reintegration, have been challenged by terrorism and the PCVE lenses. Our traditional approaches in post-conflict settings often demonstrate great inadequacies in application to our contexts. If we think, for example, of children in internally displaced or refugee camps that have been associated with extremism groups, such as Islamic State, adult fighters, or those who have been born into such groups, the political damage that is perceived often takes far greater imperative than the reality of any security threat and fails to understand how positive actions for repatriation can actually break cycles of societal cleavages and grievances across generations. An important challenge that has been raised is the lack of coordination between child protection agencies, counterterrorism agencies, and effective prevention programs. Dialogue, willingness to be open to new approaches, and the commitment to collaborate in the name of protecting children who have been recruited or used by extremism groups has not occurred sufficiently due to fear, suspicion, and mistrust. Counterterrorism activities are highly compartmentalized, often to ensure operational security. For this reason, there is little strategic complementarity in the conduct of their operations, and this principle can be applied to counterterrorism forces as well. We need to train them to understand why and how children are recruited and used by terrorist groups, and allow them to plan for potential encounters during the operational planning processes through gendered intelligence preparation of the operational environment, through scenario development and practice, as well as effective preparation to encounter children in a manner that prioritizes their protection as key to breaking cycles of recruitment. For every time we fail to adequately train to have security forces prepared, we leave the door wide open to those who wish to continue to exploit children for violent extremism use. For the most part, children are invisible, and rarely do we place their protection or perspectives at the top of our peace and security agendas globally. This is evidenced in the fact that we have children recruited and used to commit violence and to fuel and fight wars that are created by adults and benefit the powerful. I would like to leave us with one quote from an author by the name of Jason Stearns. He says, "It is not, however, helpful to personalize the evil and suggest that somehow those involved in the war harbored a superhuman capacity for evil. It is more useful to ask, what political system produced this very kind of violence, and how is it that we are in a current state of affairs where the recruitment and use of children by violent extremism groups is something that we witness on a regular basis?" Thank you very much for listening to me today, and I am grateful to all of you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ms. Whitman, for your invaluable insights. I would like now to open the floor to Ms. Law for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. I'd like to start in the spirit of reconciliation by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining you from today, the Awabakal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us here today. Thank you, Cecilia, and to the CRTG and UN for hosting this ancillary meeting. It's a welcome opportunity to join colleagues and discuss issues around children in the context of terrorism and violent extremism. And it's incredibly important that we have these conversations and that we're all joining together in order to really find a solution that is sustainable and allows children to be free from the conflict of adults. Just going to share my Today I want to talk about the rule of law and juvenile justice principles for children in a counter-terrorism context. I am currently the principal consultant with Phronesis Consulting and Training, and I'm the former director of countering violent extremism with juvenile justice in the New South Wales Department of Justice. This presentation includes my experiences working in juvenile justice and my understanding of the principles and the rules of law. A couple of the rule of law principles which are particularly relevant when we're considering children in the context of counterterrorism is an access to justice as a basic principle. Justice is a broad concept, and when we're considering justice, particularly in the notion of children, we actually have to consider their capacity for criminal responsibility. State parties are required to establish a minimum age below which children are presumed not to have the capacity for criminal responsibility, and there are currently no international standards around that. Many countries approach that very differently, and some have set the age as young as 10, while others have set the age at 14. In Australia, no state has the same age for which there is criminal responsibility of children. And this really is problematic when we're starting to discuss children in a counterterrorism or countering violent extremism context, because they really are international concepts, and children can be caught in terms of criminal responsibility in different international laws. The rule of law ensures a legal protection for human rights. And that is particularly important when you're working with children in a space of counterterrorism where a lot of the practices and legalities around them really deny basic human rights for people. There are a range of international standards and good practices for children in the broader juvenile justice system. United Nations conventions include a couple of articles around the right to freedom of expression, including to receive and impart information and ideas of all kinds. And that includes religious and political beliefs, that it's really important that we protect those rights for children because part of their job in development is actually forming those beliefs for themselves. And so in order to be able to do that, it's really important that they can express them, they can explore them, they can discuss them, and they can learn from others about them. There's also the right of access to a criminal justice system that's dedicated to children and their particular needs. Many of the counter-terrorism laws that exist around the world were designed specifically with adults in mind, and that means that they have not been designed as a criminal justice system or response that's dedicated to children with their developmental needs. The optional protocol of the United Nations, rights of the child, the right not to be used for military purposes by armed groups or by state military and intelligence agencies. And there's a bunch more rules and standards around the administration, the prevention of juvenile delinquency, and the protection of juveniles deprived of their liberty. There are also a range of international standards and protections for children. In particular, in relation to counter-terrorism, the Neuchâtel Memorandum on Good Practices explores a range of good practice for dealing with children in the juvenile justice and justice contexts. And they discuss a range of things from arrest and detention all the way through to reintegration. And they really approach it from addressing children and their protection under international law and those juvenile justice standards and how that can be embedded in juvenile justice systems around the world. The UN has principles and guidelines on children associated with armed forces or armed groups, and there's a child protection working group for the minimum standards for child protection in humanitarian action. All of these international standards and protections recognise that children are very different and have very different needs than adults, particularly in the space of counter-terrorism. So why do children participate in terrorism offences? There are a range of reasons. Some are recruited and participate by force, unwilling participants. They're either born in conflict zones, they have been raised in families where the expectation is that they will behave a particular way or join a particular group, or they've been recruited by force in regards to the local area in which they live. Some join the groups and commit offences for financial or physical security. So they engage in those kind of activities as a way of ensuring protection for their family, as a way of ensuring protection or safety, physical safety for themselves. Some do commit offences because of ideology, and it's interesting to understand that a child can hold a belief and not understand the consequences of that belief, and that's part of their developmental susceptibility. Some participate due to a desire for belonging and the protection that that belonging might afford them, and some participate due to structural factors like poverty and experiences of marginalisation. It's really important to understand the contributing factors to what motivates or ends up resulting in a child engaging in those offences. That way they can actually receive the appropriate interventions. Are children vulnerable victims or rational actors? All children who commit crimes, particularly those crimes in a counter-terrorism space, should be considered first and foremost as victims of offences against international law and not only as perpetrators. So at the same time that they may commit an offence, they are first and foremost a victim. This takes into account the fact that children do not have autonomy, often in the decisions that they make or the circumstances that they end up in, and they really are products of their environment. Children commit terrorism offences and they may have the same asymmetric impact as adults, particularly upon direct victims and society more generally, and that's why at times they can really be viewed as perpetrators of an act. Children's impact on the narrative that is used by a lot of violent extremist groups can actually be greater than that of an adult, because it can show that violent extremist group is able to actually motivate a large group of young people, which can have an impact on the narrative. Level of individual criminal responsibility which can be applied to children and the special protections they require within the justice system. That really recognises that young people are developing and that they are subsequent to a whole range of further developmental processes before they can actually understand long-term consequences, before they can engage in really well-matured consequential thinking. And the notion of securitization or protection. Security and intelligence organisations can use children. We can securitize the context in which we deal with children in a counter-terrorism space. That doesn't necessarily afford them protection. It can actually expose them to further risk. And in that respect, they become victims of the system. Some of the things that particularly impact on children and make them vulnerable and susceptible to violent extremist groups and terrorist organisations are issues around general and normal development. So brain development, which impacts on their ability for consequential thinking, for considering different points of view and arguments, for managing their impulsivity. And then there's all of the social development that occurs during the early stages into the late stages of adolescence. Individuation, which is their separation from their parents or primary caregivers. And often at this stage, they're looking for an identity that's their own, potentially separate from that of their parents. The idea that they'll develop intimacy and closeness and relationships outside of the family, and at times they can be offered to them by extremist groups. And identity formation, so they're really discovering their own personal beliefs, what their values are. And it's really important at that stage that they have an ability to have those conversations with people and to really think about the information that's being given to them by extremist groups. These processes of development, both brain development and developing socially and identity development, mean that young people and children are incredibly susceptible to the narratives, to the recruitment strategies of violent extremist and terrorist organisations. And it's why they really do need to be considered as victims in this process. They are being actively recruited because they are susceptible and vulnerable, and because they are very easy to move from a point of holding a belief to acting on a belief. And so it's that process of applying the motivation to act that becomes their biggest vulnerability. We need a specialised justice system for children, and particularly when we're dealing with counter-terrorism and violent extremist organisations. So in many places, children charged with terrorism offences are subject to the same processes and contexts as adults. They're treated as adults in the legal system through the judicial process, through the investigative stage, and then through the process of rehabilitation and reintegration as well. Most counter-terrorism legislation and practices rarely differentiate children from adults. A specialised juvenile justice system should have the primary jurisdiction over children charged with terrorism offences, and this includes the entirety of that justice system, from specialised investigators who understand how to speak to and interview a child, all the way through to those people who end up working with that child around rehabilitation. In all actions concerning children with that system, the best interests of the child should always be a primary consideration. And that should include things like alternatives to prosecution, diversion from custody, rehabilitation and reintegration into society. They should be the primary considerations when dealing with a child. These systems should be based on a knowledge of child development. They should reflect child's reasoning and cognitive abilities and should consider their vulnerabilities and individual capacities. There needs to be flexibility within the processes to take into account where the child is at, where their development is at, and also what their potential is in terms of rehabilitation and reintegration. Throughout the system, there needs to be an investment in prevention, and that is addressing the structural and systemic drivers that engage children in terrorism to begin with. That prevention work needs to include raising awareness and education for people working with children around what are the indicators, what are some of the early signs that children may be getting involved in violent extremism or terrorism, and how do we prevent those drivers more broadly. Through the investigation and arrest stage, it's about identifying options for diversion or alternatives. So noticing a child or young person who may be involved in a violent extremist organisation or in contact with a terrorist group, the first option should be diversion. How do you engage that child and how do you look for diversion alternatives, as opposed to waiting until they hit a threshold of arrest? Throughout the trial, there should be child-friendly practices and appropriately trained and experienced officials. And that includes not just the prosecution and defence, but also judges, court support staff, and ensuring that the process is understandable to a child so that they know what it is that's actually happening during that process. Sentencing should include considerations of alternatives to custodial-based sentences. And even though terrorism offences are considered some of the most serious offences to be committed, there needs to be consideration about the maturity of the child when they made those decisions, their engagement in that, and the factors that were impacting on that child engaging. And there should be individualisation and proportionality in sentencing for children. And there should be consideration around parole for any child who receives a custodial sentence, which is really around preparing children for reintegration with consideration of appropriately supervised and supported parole periods. Those periods should be long. They should include well-trained practitioners to support that, and they should be focused on reintegration into families and communities. The involvement of and collaboration with families and communities in the justice process is really vital for effective rehabilitation and reintegration. That's at every level of the justice process. It should begin at the point of arrest. Families and communities should be involved in the process throughout any custodial period, and particularly at the point that we're looking to reintegrate. Multisectoral approaches are best, and that means involving a range of practitioners and people who are most effective in supporting and managing children. That might include psychologists, social workers, but it could also include local community members and particularly family members as well. And so those approaches, which include a range of perspectives and a range of practitioners, also need to have a focus on specialised programs, services and professionals. That means that they should really be trained, they should understand child development and things that impact on children's behaviour, and also they should understand the counterterrorism and violent extremism space. Child-related programs and practices should be monitored and evaluated to ensure not only compliance with standards and measure outcomes, but to ensure that we're measuring outcomes distinct from those that address adult offending. At the moment, there is a gap in the evaluation of programs specifically designed for adolescents, children, young people in the space of counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. And often what that means is children are given adult programs which are not necessarily effective for use with children. Some of the current challenges for children in the juvenile justice context. Children as young as 7 can be prosecuted under some countries' terrorism legislation, which means they can be held criminally responsible for something from the age of 7. The average around the world is at 10 years, with some countries identifying 14 as the youngest a child can be charged or convicted. Custodial sentences are often mandatory for terrorism offences, regardless of the age at the time of the offence, and often those custodial sentences are large and don't include consideration for extended periods of parole for reintegration back into the community. Some countries still allow for children convicted of terrorism offences to face the death penalty. Many countries allow for preventative detention to apply to children who they believe would be likely to commit a terrorism offence. And there are extraterritorial jurisdiction powers over children and the complications of the foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon, where children may be involved in offshore activity with their families and the complications that arise from that when they return to their home country. We do have a pressing need to act. Children and young people are increasingly becoming involved in acts of violent extremism and terrorism. They're being actively recruited by a wide range of organisations across the spectrum of violent extremism. Children need to be protected, and they must be supported and encouraged to divert or disengage from involvement with terrorist organisations or violent extremist beliefs. They simply don't understand the long-term consequences. Counterterrorism strategies without a commitment to human rights and the rights of the child at their core will likely fail to address the factors contributing to terrorism and will contribute to the ongoing vulnerability and recruitment of children to violent extremist organisations. And the failure to correctly respond and adequately address these children will see many of them who've been victimised take on the role of perpetrator in the future, and the cycle of violence will continue. I want to thank you for the opportunity to raise these issues and hope ongoing conversations about how we can improve our responses to children in the space of counterterrorism.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lowe, for articulating in such a comprehensive manner regarding the stages of children cognitive development, its impact on drivers to join an extremist organization, and also for reminding us of the importance of conformity with international law and principle of juvenile justice for children in conflict with the law in a counterterrorism space, and for offering your precious recommendations also. I am now happy to open the floor to Dr. Anita Perezin. Ms. Perezin, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dear colleagues, I thank the CRTG Working Group for having organized this event, and I'm honored to represent the Radicalization Awareness Network run in this high-level forum. Could you please share my presentation? Thank you. Next slide, please. One is a network of over 6,000 frontline practitioners founded in 2007 by the European Commission, who are engaged in both preventing and countering violent extremism and rehabilitating and reintegrating violent extremists into society. My presentation today will summarize what we, as the RAN community, have shared among the practitioners, researchers, and policymakers at the European Union level about vulnerable children brought up in an extremist environment in Syria and Iraq. For the presentation and RAN work, children are considered as minors under the age of 18. Next slide, please. In the past few years, the international community has been increasingly confronted with the recruitment and exploitation of children by terrorist and violent extremist groups. Owing to the reach and propaganda of such groups, child recruitment and exploitation are in no way limited to conflict-ridden areas. We differentiate 5 categories of children vulnerable to current or future radicalization and violence. In the first category are children who left Europe to live in ISIS-held territory with their families or alone, as it was mostly the case with teenagers and adolescents, as well as those born to European parents there. Then children traveling from other conflict zones as refugees or migrants, either with their parents or otherwise unaccompanied. Children of homegrown ISIS supporters or sympathizers who support ISIS domestically, and other children at risk of radicalization or at risk of being targeted by extremist groups and terrorist recruiters. I will focus on children from the first categories, since one of the main issues today is how to successfully repatriate them and reintegrate back to the society, because child returnees from Syria and Iraq, depending on their age of course, are viewed as both as humanitarian, security, and reintegration challenge. Next slide. It is that around 5,300 men and women from Europe have left Iraq since 2012. It is estimated that around 1,000 children left together with their families, and that some 600 were born there to European parents. Despite ISIS having been territorially defeated since 2019, the United Nations reported in January last year that 8,000 children of foreign terrorist fighters remain in the custody of the Syrian Democratic Forces, with 700 to 750 of these children believed to be European. These children did not voluntarily join the ISIS Caliphate. They were either brought into the terrorist group by their parents, who served ISIS in various capacities. Some teenagers also traveled to and joined ISIS of their own volition, but even these must be considered for repatriation in terms of the level of maturity and understanding at the time they undertook to do so. Next slide, please. Therefore, we divide child return into 3 age groups. In the first are teenagers and adolescents, so those from 10 to 17 years, and are preschoolers and younger children from 4 to 10 years, and are infants and toddlers from 0 to 3 years. Important to divide them into different age categories because children from the first 2 age categories were exposed to indoctrination and violence to a much greater degree than infants and toddlers, of course, and therefore require a different approach and intervention type. Gender-based differences are also important when we talk about children, since boys and girls were exposed to different types of trauma and played very different roles in ISIS. Next slide, please. Fully understanding the experience of ISIS children is a critical aspect for their integration and our ability to provide them trauma-informed support services upon return. Next slide. After the proclamation of the so-called Caliphate in 2014, an important part of ISIS propaganda was the promotion of the Cubs of the Caliphate, a group of boys from the age of 6 who were systematically indoctrinated and trained to actively participate in violent ISIS activities. Even though there is no evidence that all the boys of that age were obliged to undergo such training, it is well known that some children were kidnapped, forced, lured, or placed by their parents in ISIS Cubs of the Caliphate training camps. Next slide. While we cannot say that all children in ISIS share the same experience, there is no doubt that they all suffer from various types of trauma. All certainly experienced war atrocities, loss of parents or family members, and led a life in fear. They likely witnessed horrific violence, torture, and executions, or have been abused themselves. Some older boys were probably given weapons or combat training, and possibly training in carrying out suicide bombings. Some might have participated in military activities, and potentially in executions and suicide bombing missions, while at the same time some girls might have been exposed to forced marriages, sexual abuse, and childbirthing from a very young age. Some of the older children might have been highly indoctrinated by ISIS propaganda and educated to react with anger and hate against ISIS enemies. Next slide, please. Additionally, in consideration of the harsh living conditions in detention camps, experts warn that a prolonged repatriation of children to home countries might lead to their further victimization and radicalization. It could also decrease the success of reintegration and resocialization programs once they return, while living without proper education, diet, and medical care will certainly hamper their normal growth and well-being. Next slide. However, there are many challenges to repatriation, ranging from legal and security implications to matters of logistics. Next slide. We can see two approaches in the repatriation of children. Some countries have taken a passive approach. They prioritize a case-by-case approach or give a priority to orphans, while others decided to repatriate all the children irrespective of their age or family status. Next slide, please. In addition, current experience shows that child returnees could face new traumatic experience after return, with local authorities and society, as well as separation from parents, lack of sufficient parental guidance and family support, stigmatization and social isolation, and various mental health issues, including PTSD, etc. Next slide, please. Exposure to multiple and repeated traumatic events before and after arrival might represent a significant risk to the development and well-being of those children. Therefore, care must be taken that any measures to be implemented should exclude additional traumatization. Next slide, please. It is important to mention here the phenomenon of transgenerational transmission of trauma and effects of PTSD. It means that children might suffer in many ways from mental health issues of their parents, but it also means that we should not be focused solely on child returnees, but also on children of returning foreign terrorist fighters who can also suffer from transgenerational transmission of trauma of their parents or one parent, or could be further exposed to transgenerational transmission of extremist ideologies. Next slide. Concerning the child care, the RAN practitioners warned how experience with other traumatized children, such as child soldiers of other conflicts, as well as child refugees, children affected by war, child criminal gang or cult members, child victims of abuse or sex trafficking, etc., may be similar enough to borrow lessons learned for child returnees from Syria and Iraq. Next slide. A proactive approach and conditions tailored to each child are therefore highly advised. That includes preparation of a return plan for each child before their return, with detailed actions and information on who might take over the care of the child and which types of support they need. Then, the implementation of a child assessment system consisting of physical and mental health evaluation and adequate risk and need assessment, as well as establishment of a multi-agency childcare system, which should include immediate care and long-term support from relevant services. Next slide. We already have several case studies that have indicated the potential for successful repatriation of children. Examples of good practice include normalization of the children's everyday life based on regular schooling and adaptation to the domestic school system after return. Various types of behavioral problems, such as changes in mood, problems with concentration and sleeping disorders, just to mention some, show the necessity to provide appropriate child psychology counseling and support. Support is essential not only for children, but also for their families, because families are our key partners in resocialization and reintegration programs and thus should be properly counseled and supported. One of the major challenges is the lack of specific nationality, which could hamper legal status of children, as well as the lack of funds and resources, which might be an obstacle to a comprehensive multi-level approach in dealing with children. Therefore, building capacity that could provide multi-level services to support returning children, their families, their home communities should be paramount. Next slide, please. And to conclude, there is no one-size-fits-all strategy that could be applied equally to all children. Current experience and best practices shared within the RUN community has shown that each child requires a tailored individual approach and solutions based on age, gender, experience, and the level of trauma. Also, all children require a long-term care and intervention whose effectiveness should be regularly monitored and evaluated. But to achieve a proper support to these children and their families, it is also important to create favorable conditions for all professionals working with them, because there are many challenges they face owing to their inexperience in working with traumatized children as child returnees from Syria and Iraq. There is the necessity to establish a holistic multi-agency approach and the need of information sharing, but such sharing must respect the child's privacy and rights to avoid stigmatization and future labeling of these children. Also, it is important to be aware that the possible effects of PTSD and other trauma could be return to violence even many years after the traumatic event. This is why it exists a critical need to provide these children proper immediate care and long-term support. In summary, and in consideration of the information I have presented today, we must first and foremost view these children as victims of crimes and abuse and unfortunate and unspeakable circumstances. We also have an obligation and responsibility to protect and to care for these children and to guide them toward a more productive and happy childhood and adolescence. I'm reminded that children are agents of our communities and societies, and as such, our compassion and resources are not only a short-term investment in their reintegration, but also collateral pledge toward the promise of long-term peace for future generations. On the next slide, you can see the selection of RUN papers covering the topics I presented today. And ladies and gentlemen, this concludes my briefing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Perezzini, for bringing to our attention the challenges to repatriation of children of foreign terrorist fighters brought by their parents to Syria and Iraq, or who have born into the armed conflict, and also for highlighting the importance of our responsibility to develop comprehensive systems of intervention and care in their support. I am now honored to welcome a video statement from a special representative of Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, Virginia Gamba.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Working Group on Children Recruited by Terrorist Groups for hosting important discussions the 14th United Nations Crime Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. I wish I could be with you today. The protection of children from armed conflict and the prevention of violations against children are the key priorities of the Children and Armed Conflict Mandate. The changing nature of contemporary conflict, its dynamics, and an evolving number of non-state armed groups has created unprecedented challenges for the protection of children in recent years. Boys and girls have been increasingly targeted by Security Council-designated terrorist groups as well as by other armed groups, which is a worrying trend demanding our attention. The violation of abduction by itself has seen the largest increase in cases over the past 18 months. That said, states themselves have also created new hurdles for child protection in this context, often by prioritizing counterterrorism measures that can seriously impact children's rights. Holding children in detention for alleged association with armed groups often together with adults, is one such challenge that needs to be urgently overcome. These are just a couple of the reasons why today's discussion is of such a timely and vital importance. As you know, my office monitors and reports on 6 grave violations against children in situations of armed conflict. The recruitment and use of children by armed forces and groups is one of these violations. In 2019 alone, more than 7,700 children were verified as having been recruited and used in some of the 19 situations covered by my agenda at that time. Among those, 90% were used by non-state actors, including UN-designated terrorist groups. The cycle of victimization of children begins with the recruitment, and in most countries covered by my agenda, forced recruitment, including through abduction, continues to be prevalent. Abduction was the most prominent violation verified in 2020 in the whole of the Lake Chad Basin region, with Boko Haram and affiliated groups as the main perpetrators. The kidnappings of hundreds of schoolboys and girls in Nigeria attest to these horrendous atrocities. Coercion and abduction are not the only methods employed in recruitment and use of children, nevertheless. In Syria and Iraq, for example, children have traveled under their own volition from their country of residence to join armed groups such as ISIL, and once there were often forced to cross national borders during their association. The issue of children traveling to a foreign, often to accompany and join their relatives, land, or children born in those locales without any identification documents has also confounded and complicated the protection of children often stranded far away from their and or their parents' countries of origin. Notwithstanding how they are recruited, children associated with armed groups, including those designated as terrorist organizations, are caught in an atrocious cycle of violence. Boys are often used in direct hostilities, inducing injuries and killings, while girls can be subject to sexual violence, including sexual enslavement and forced marriage. Girls have also been used as carriers of personal-born improvised explosive devices or human bombs, a particularly despicable practice of Boko Haram, but of course not limited to that group alone. We must continually remind ourselves that children used by parties to conflict, regardless of a child's thought, intention, or deed, are first and foremost victims. They are young people that we collectively fail to protect, and who fell victim to opportunistic elements that weaponize their vulnerability. As such, it is incumbent upon all of us to treat them first as victims and as children, whose participation in hostilities bears serious long-term consequences for their physical and psychological health. I hasten to add that this does not absolve them from blame, but if there is evidence to suggest that a person under 18 committed a criminal act, they should be tried using international juvenile justice standards, which is not often the case. Even when these children manage to escape or exit these groups, their ordeal is not over, as boys and girls are often detained on security-related charges and criminalized for their actual or alleged association with terrorist groups, perpetuating an infernal cycle of violence. As we speak, thousands of children, including children of foreign fighters, are still held in camps in northeast Syria and Iraq, without access to proper reintegration programs, making their safety, mental health, and overall development precarious in the extreme. Detained children are thus critically vulnerable and often report ill treatment and violence, including sexual violence, torture, and exploitation while in detention. In these settings, they are exposed to further trauma and stigmatization and remain at risk of radicalization and re-recruitment due to their proximity to members of terrorist and armed groups. Moreover, children in detention are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, as they are often denied access to proper health and protection services. To break cycles of violence and build sustainable peace, we must protect children's rights before, during, and after an armed conflict. Adopting a human rights approach to counter-terrorism is not only a legal imperative, but also the most effective way to combat such acts. The detention of children, including children not from the country in which they are found, should be used as a measure of last resort and for the shortest possible period of time, with respect for their fundamental rights, due process, and the application of international juvenile justice standards. The repatriation of foreign children to their country of origin should be facilitated and prioritized in line with international law principles, including the principle of non-refoulement, and with respect for the best interests of the child. Once released, children must receive rehabilitation and reintegration support. Such programming should always be long-term, gender-responsive, addresses stigmatization upon return, include mental health and psychosocial support, education and vocational training, and access to civil registry. In addition, responses should be tailored to each child's situation to provide a continuum of support that successfully reintegrates them back into society. In conclusion, the root causes of conflict and child recruitment must be addressed urgently as a strategic investment in both our humanitarian principles and our quest for lasting peace. Research has shown that there are multifaceted and intertwined factors motivating or forcing children to join armed groups, from economic necessity to social marginalization to revenge. Preventing the recruitment and use of children from occurring in the first place is the best child protection we can have. These children are our future, and with them lies the hope of breaking the cycle of conflict. It is my hope that discussions such as the one we are having today will result in a better understanding of the reality for children in situations of armed conflict and a greater respect for their rights. To this end, we need to rethink the treatment of children associated with armed groups, including UN-designated terrorist groups. Even these children must be seen first and foremost as victims who are trapped in a conflict they did not originate nor understand. Treat children as children. That is our common responsibility. I thank you.
I am now delighted to open the floor to Mr. Williams on behalf of the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations in Vienna. Mr. William, please, we welcome your remarks.
Of the most vulnerable among us remains incredibly shocking and tragic. Unfortunately, children offer terrorist and violent extremist groups important advantages in that they are often able to move freely and without suspicion. This is why Boko Haram is using children in forced suicide attacks, and Daesh has involved children in its most heinous acts. Such exploitation of children constitutes a gross and unconscionable violation of human rights. Sadly, these children forced into terrorist movements are left victimized and traumatized by their experiences. In addition, by traumatizing the youngest generations, this exploitation is also helping to perpetuate an ongoing cycle of violence. Daesh was particularly expert in its exploitation and recruitment of children. They socialized, indoctrinated, and mobilized thousands of children as cubs of the Caliphate in support of their operations. The issue is very close to Canada's heart, particularly given advocacy on the issue of child soldiers by one of our national heroes, Romeo Dallaire, which has raised international understanding of this issue and has helped to achieve positive change. We were very encouraged to see this work getting international attention from Executive Director Whitman's presentation on this panel today. From our government's perspective, Canada has implemented a range of tools and programs designed to help individuals counter and disengage from violent extremist groups and reintegrate into Canadian society. These domestic intervention programs are gender, age, and trauma-informed, and are generally led by health and social service professionals who address the risks, needs, and vulnerabilities of individuals on a case-by-case basis, including through family support and work with child services. Our main program to these initiatives is the Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence, which leads the Government of Canada's efforts to prevent and counter radicalization to violence. Launched in 2017 within the Department of Public Safety, the Canada Centre funds CDE intervention programs across the country and supports research and promotion of best practices to address this complex issue. The government also provides support towards international counterterrorism and preventing and countering violent extremist efforts. Programming addresses reintegration and disengagement strategies, including amongst youth, and aims to reduce terrorist threats by strengthening community resilience, supporting community policing, and improving communication between communities, civil society, and security providers. Internationally, Canada will continue to advocate that our global approach to CT and CVE is responsive, coherent, gender-informed, and practically supports the work of frontline practitioners who are at the core of encountering violent extremism and terrorism in their local communities. Canada believes long-term sustainable success of CT and CVE requires civilian-led, evidence-based efforts that respect human rights, emphasize inclusion and diversity, and build on local strengths and capabilities. Canada's approach is also increasingly working to build the connections between humanitarian, development, and peace and security actors, recognizing that aligning our work across these three areas is needed to address the root causes of conflict and strengthening community resilience. Particularly in the lead up to the 7th biannual review of the UN's Global Counterterrorism Strategy this spring, Canada is committed to bringing the voices of women and youth, civil society organizations, and victims of terrorism to the table and meaningfully integrate their input into our peace and security efforts. Canada looks forward to continuing our constructive and cooperative discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. As I see that there are no questions from our audiences, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for taking time and for their remarkable insights. I would also like to extend my deepest gratitude to the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict and to Special Representative Virginia Gamba for participating to this high-level event, for the continuous dedication in protecting children affected by armed conflict, children recruited into armed groups, including those designated as terrorist organizations, and for the unfaltering commitment to leave no child behind. Thank you to the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations for partnering with the CRTG Working Group in this high-level forum. We feel privileged for your participation. Thank you also to the technical host for their invaluable support. Thank you to the UNODC, to Gary Hill, and to the Government of Japan for hosting this Congress. And thank you also to everyone who kindly assisted to the important discussion. The exploitation of children by terrorist actors is a major contributor to the extreme violence that we see in the world. Violence that we globally experience because of terrorism, violence that we experience because of terrorism. The involvement of children in terrorism does not only serve the satisfaction of short-term purposes, but is enshrined in a deeper, darker rationale that ensuring the survival of extremist ideologies and the perpetuation of conflict and instability intergenerationally, at the expense of youth groups, at the expense of children, at the expense of communities and societies, and at the expense of peace. I will conclude by reaffirming the CRTG Working Group commitment to strengthen multilateral collaboration to prevent violence brought against children by terrorist actors, United Nations entities, member states, civil society, and the private sector to align voices, efforts, and undertake a collective and concerted action to defend the rights and well-being of children affected by the brutality of terrorism. The systematic focus of terrorist organizations recruitment heighten the urgency of designing and implementing comprehensive, coordinated, and cohesive responses. The involvement of every sector of our societies. It requires a strategy, resilience, and perspective, and I am confident that unity of effort is key to the achievement of positive results, and that through our shared commitment, we can make a difference and eliminate all forms of violence against children. Thank you.